cartilage that was torn, but the cartilage had been abrading the bone surfaces of his knee for 2 years while he played on it. And being that I'm about to have knee replacement surgery for exactly the same reason, I can only guess what it took for him to continue to play. Yes, I think his speed was affected dramatically, not necessarily in how fast he could get down the line, but in his ability to cut or lateral movements. I think that is so rare to have the defining day of your life, or professional life anyway, occur at the very beginning of it. So that injury just informed everything for the rest of his career. And he was always being measured. And I would say he was always measuring himself against that elusive what if he hadn't been hurt? And now from this vantage point, you look back and say, what if he'd been born 20 years later? He could have had the knee surgery, he'd been out a year and he'd come back as good as new.
Yeah, and one of the things that you get into in the book as well is that modern analytics has been very kind to him because he did the kinds of things that weren't publicized in the 50s and 60s, but we now recognize as valuable, such as getting a lot of walks.
Yeah, so his on-base percentage is extremely high and higher than May's, I believe. I haven't looked at those.
Yeah, definitely.
But, May's was clearly the more complete player. Mantle was not an instinctive outfielder. He learned it, and he had what my first sports orthopedist called neuromuscular genius. How do these guys who do things that we all grew up pretending or wanting to do, like make that catch in center field to preserve Don Larson's World Series perfect game? How did he get there? How did he have the timing, especially considering his injury? How did he get there? How did he know where the ball was going to be? How did he outrun it? And Steve Haas said, these guys have another thing, one of those intelligences that nobody, can test for on an IQ test. And Mantle certainly had that. And he became certainly a good center fielder, a very good center fielder, but he wasn't Willie Mays. So he has suffered in that regard. He certainly regretted not retiring after 65 when the Yankees went to hell in a handbasket, and when he would have had a lifetime 300 average, because back then, those black numbers mattered. And, he ended up with a lifetime 298. And I think that really, really got to him.
You talked about Willie Mays, and of course you earlier talked about the fact that the original plan was to do a book on Willie, Mickey, and the Duke. How seriously did Mickey Mantle take the, quote, rivalry with Mays and even with Duke Snider? Was this something he was aware of both in his career and after?
No. I mean, he was in the American League. He saw Duke in the World Series and at the annual exhibition game series that the Yankees and Dodgers would play before the actual season started, after they came north. But no, I mean, the relationships were, you were in your clubhouse. Those were your guys. You were going to war with them. You said something interesting before about how different Koufax and Mantle are. And on the surface, they appear complete polar opposites in Mantle blonde and blue-eyed and, incredibly chesty with Popeye arms, and Koufax, and he's the Okie, right? He's the yokel, come to the big city to become famous. And Sandy obviously was a Brooklyn kid, some college, dark, tall, slim in appearance, though he was not as slim as he appeared because he was so beautifully proportioned. But they were similar in two ways. They were heroes in their own clubhouses because they both played with such extraordinary pain. And they also were really good and I mean serious teammates. They'd do anything for their teammates. And I heard, endless stories of Mantle's generosity to the guys in the clubhouse, to rookies, or people who were making. And remember, they weren't making that much money. And Sandy, by contrast, would sit in the Dodger clubhouse. This was, after they left Brooklyn, and he and Maury Wills, who created the running game of modern baseball, and isn't given enough credit for it, would read each other's hate letters aloud while they soaked various aching parts of their bodies. Sandy still refers to people who are Dodgers, even if he didn't play with them, as a teammate. And that's the kind of ethos that they both came out of.
Yeah, you mentioned he was respected and liked as a teammate, and I was wondering if you could compare him a little bit to DiMaggio, the man who he ultimately ended up replacing in center field, because it seems like DiMaggio was, again, a very, very different kind of guy.
Yeah, I assume you've read Richard Ben Kramer's book on DiMaggio, and who comes off as what can you say? a grand and unimpeachable athlete who treated everybody like shit. Basically, there are stories in my book about him, but read Richard's if you really want to.
Yeah, I'll second that recommendation.
It's a great book. And Richard and I were writing. He was writing DiMaggio, and I was writing Koufax. And I remember we had this conversation, in which he told me how much he envied me because I was writing about somebody I liked. And it's true. What a gift to write about somebody who turns out to be so much better a person than you expected. My first words to Sandy Koufax is, I hated you because of what you did to Mickey Mantle. I think that charmed him. It may be why he was willing to help me to the extent that he did. Whereas Richard was struggling because he was finding out that this, the Yankee Clipper was a shit.
Right.
His treatment of women was appalling. He was cheap. In his later years, if Yankee at old timer days, if he would ask, if teammates would ask him for autographed balls, he wanted money for them. Billy Crystal tells that story about being at is it an old timers day? It's one of the celebrations of Mantle, I think, after Mantle died in 95. And he had neglected to call Joe DiMaggio the greatest living player, greatest living Yankee. And DiMaggio turns around and punches him in the stomach because he's so pissed at him. So it's, that's crazy. I'm glad I didn't have to write about Joe DiMaggio. It's a very tough thing to live with and then put in, between hard covers as somebody that unlikable. And Mantle, by the way, I might say, it took me a long time to find a way to empathize with Mantle, because as he became, as you know, he was an alcoholic, an undiagnosed alcoholic. He came up, and this is where the Cafe Society in New York plays a part. He came up at a time and at a place where everybody drank. 3 martini lunches. My first boss in publishing literally went out for 3 martini lunches, and that was back in 75, 76. And everybody wanted to buy the Mick a drink. And in his later years, when he was a falling down, mean drunk, it was kind of vicious because they'd buy him a drink and be able to say, Mantle and drink, and what an asshole, But there was no education. There was no support. There was no way for him to understand how deeply that disease ran in his family. I think it was one of his cousins. I can't remember. I apologize. Who told me about an aunt one of his mother's sisters, so Lovell's sister Blanche, who was found dead in her bed, a week after she had died from alcohol poisoning. And, I was told that every one of Lovell's siblings had a problem with alcohol. But he didn't know that. He didn't know what that meant. He didn't know what it meant to have a genetic inheritance that predisposed you to a problem. The statistic that always stays with me is that, there's 15% of the population for whom a case of beer is always an invitation. If I drank a case of beer, which is implausible, but if I drank a case of beer, the next day, the last thing I would want to do is drink another case of beer.
Right.
But in alcoholics' biochemistry, there is no such revulsion. Not to the extent that you'd stop. So, there was no way for him to understand what he was grappling with. There was an occasion in 1961. This is one of the things I found out that really astonished me. Players got together, not, all of them, but it was Yogi and Joe Demestri, strangely, and I can't, God help me, Justin, I don't remember. A bunch of them took him out to Yogi's house in New Jersey to try to get him to sober up, and it worked for a while. They got him to move into this apartment on, across from LaGuardia with Maris and Bob Serve. And he had that great, great, great year where he and Maris chased each other in Babe Ruth's home run record, across the country. And the sad thing is, for an alcoholic, it was probably inevitable. He gets to September and, he wants the bright lights of Manhattan again. And he said, "See you, folks." And he went back to Manhattan and all his old ways, and ended up, ceding the home run title to Maris because he got sick. He got a venereal disease, and he went to a doctor who gave him a dirty shot, guy who was famous for giving speed to John F. Kennedy, among others, Dr. Feelgood, and it became infected, and that's why he couldn't play. That's why he ended up falling out of the home run race. Billy Crystal, by the way, was really mad at me for writing that. I remember telling him it after I spoke to him about 1961, because of course he made that, great movie, and Mantle was his hero too. He said, "You're not going to write that, are you?" I went, "Yeah, that's my job. Yeah, I'm going to write that." But I felt great empathy for him, for Mantle, that is, because the alcoholism was in part an inheritance, a genetic inheritance, and it may well have been, to some extent, a way to mitigate physical pain he lived with and played with. But it was also the result of sexual abuse that he endured as a child. His wife, Merlin, had disclosed that in a book that she and his surviving sons published after his death. I think it's called A Hero All His Life.
Right.
But I was able to find out more about the extent of it, and that it was not just a one and done. There were several different occasions and several different people who abused him. And when you look at the constellation of behaviors that adolescent boys who are abused manifest as adults, Mickey had all of them. Kind of a sense of living a double life, which he did at the end of his life. The alcoholism. If I open my book, I might be able to remember the rest of them. And suddenly he made sense,
Right.
I could sort of go, oh, now I get it. I don't know that that anybody has done that for Joe DiMaggio.
Yeah, I was going to say, because you have two extremes you mentioned of Koufax, who you come away with great admiration and respect for. You have a DiMaggio who you can't help but to think, boy, this guy was an asshole. And then you have Mickey Mantle. when you're done with all your research and you've written all of it and you've got this full picture of him,